There's a quiet shift happening right now that most people only notice once it is already too late to ignore. It is not loud, it is not announced, and it is not led by slogans or marches, but it is reshaping how men and women interact at the most basic level. What looks like a small change in behavior is actually the surface of something much deeper. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand why this moment matters, why it did not appear out of nowhere, and why it is not going away. What we are seeing today did not begin with smart glasses or cameras or new technology, even though that is the part making headlines. This began years ago with incentives, narratives, and systems that rewarded accusation over accountability and emotion over evidence. For decades, men were told to be careful, to watch what they say, to watch how they look, to watch how they move, to assume guilt before innocence, and to trust that the system would be fair if they did everything right. Many men did exactly that. And what they learned along the way is that caution alone was never enough. Now technology has entered the room and it has changed the balance in a way no one in mainstream discussion seems comfortable admitting. Men are beginning to record interactions, not out of hostility, not out of spite, but out of self protection and documentation. This is happening in public spaces, social settings, professional environments, and casual interactions that used to rely on trust and good faith. Cameras do not argue, they do not exaggerate, and they do not reinterpret conversations after the fact. They simply show what happened, and that single fact is why this shift is provoking such an emotional response. When mainstream media covers this story, the framing is predictable. The focus is placed almost entirely on discomfort, privacy concerns, and how being recorded can present someone in an unflattering light. The implication is that recording itself is the harm rather than the behavior being documented. What is rarely discussed is why so many men feel the need to do this in the first place and why this behavior is spreading rather than fading. Men did not wake up one day and decide to change the rules. They responded to rules that had already been rewritten around them. For years, men were told that allegations alone could end careers, reputations, and livelihoods. They were told that believing someone's claim was more important than verifying it. They were told that discomfort was evidence and that intent no longer mattered. In that environment, recording interactions becomes the rational response. Documentation is not an attack, it is a shield. And once a shield exists, it is not going to be voluntarily surrendered. There is also a legal reality that rarely gets addressed honestly in public conversation. In many jurisdictions, recording is lawful with the consent of one party. That means the person doing the recording does not need permission from anyone else involved. This is not a loophole or a trick. It is written law, and it exists because evidence matters in disputes. Attempting to ban recording in those places would require rewriting long-standing legal standards that were never created with gendered outcomes in mind. Even if new restrictions were attempted, enforcement would be nearly impossible in a world where recording devices are increasingly small, wearable, and integrated into everyday objects. What makes this moment uncomfortable is not the presence of cameras, but the loss of narrative control. When interactions are recorded, reinterpretation becomes difficult. Context cannot be easily removed. Tone cannot be selectively remembered. What happened is what happened, and that reality has consequences. This is why some are calling for restrictions, because once evidence exists, claims must align with facts, and that standard applies to everyone equally. The workplace is one of the areas where this shift is most visible. Professional environments have spent years emphasizing compliance training, reporting structures, and policies designed to prevent misconduct. On paper, these systems promise fairness, but in practice, many men learned that participation carried risk regardless of behavior. Recording interactions in professional settings changes that dynamic. It protects both parties when used responsibly, but it also removes ambiguity. And Ambiguity has been a powerful tool for leverage. Without it, interactions become more formal, more distant, and more transactional. This growing distance is not driven by anger, it is driven by risk assessment. When the cost of misunderstanding is too high, people reduce exposure. That is not hostility, it is adaptation. Men are not trying to punish anyone. They are responding to an environment where personal cost is asymmetrical and consequences are unpredictable. Recording interactions is simply one layer of that response. To understand where this leads, it helps to look at a real world example that unfolded years earlier in a different cultural context. In South Korea, a similar dynamic emerged, not around cameras, but around policy and compliance. Men were told that normal interactions were problematic, that asking for dates was intrusive, that humor could be offensive, and that persistence was inappropriate. Instead of arguing these points endlessly, many men chose a different approach. They agreed fully and completely and then followed the rules exactly as written. This approach became known informally as fighting policy with policy, or compliance taken to its logical extreme. If asking a woman out more than a limited number of times could lead to consequences, men simply stopped asking. If workplace interactions were risky, men minimized them. If mentoring could be misinterpreted, men opted out. The rules were followed perfectly, and the outcome was not what policymakers expected. What happened next was not celebration, but frustration. Women who supported these restrictions began to experience the unintended effects of isolation, reduced opportunity, and social stagnation. Dating declined sharply, informal networks disappeared, media content lost its spontaneity, everyday interactions became rigid and cautious, the environment became safe on paper, but sterile in practice. This shift did not require hostility or protest. It required only agreement. Men did not resist the rules, they accepted them, and that acceptance exposed the consequences. When interaction becomes risky, interaction becomes rare. When association carries potential cost, association becomes conditional. This is not ideological, it is practical. The demographic consequences of this approach are now well documented. South Korea faces one of the lowest birth rates in the world, and governments are openly discussing incentives to encourage dating and family formation. Financial encouragement is being offered because trust, once lost, cannot be rebuilt through messaging alone. When people learn that withdrawal is safer than engagement, reversing that lesson is extraordinarily difficult. The relevance of this example is not cultural, it is structural. Systems shape behavior. When rules punish initiative, initiative disappears. When ambiguity favors accusation, documentation becomes necessary. When trust is replaced with procedure, relationships become contractual. These are not emotional reactions, they are logical outcomes. Today, similar patterns are emerging elsewhere, driven not by policy alone, but by social norms, media narratives, and legal incentives. Men are learning from precedent. They are choosing compliance, distance, and documentation over risk. Cameras are simply the latest tool in that evolution, not the cause of it. There is also an economic dimension that cannot be ignored. Financial pressure amplifies social tension. As living costs rise and expectations remain high, partnerships are increasingly evaluated through a lens of utility and security. Men who were told for decades that they were not needed are now being asked why they are absent. That question misses the point. Absence is not rebellion, it is the result of repeated instruction. Trust cannot be demanded, it is built through reciprocity and accountability and shared risk. When one side bears the majority of consequence, trust erodes. Recording interactions does not create that erosion, it reveals it. The discomfort people feel is not about cameras, it is about visibility. What we are witnessing is not a temporary trend, it is a recalibration. Men are not trying to dominate, control, or retaliate. They are trying to navigate an environment where words alone are no longer sufficient protection. Evidence has become the currency of safety. And once a currency exists, people will use it. This is why attempts to frame this behavior as malicious fail to resonate. Men using documentation are not acting emotionally, they are acting defensively. They are not seeking attention, they are seeking clarity. And clarity has a way of reshaping systems, whether institutions are ready for it or not. As this continues, interactions will become more deliberate, more cautious, and more structured. That may reduce conflict, but it also reduces warmth. That trade off is not ideological, it is mechanical. Systems designed to eliminate risk often eliminate connection as well. The deeper question is not whether recording should happen, but why it feels necessary. Until that question is addressed honestly, surface level debates will continue to miss the mark. Technology does not create social fractures, it exposes them. Cameras did not break trust, they arrived after trust was already damaged. This moment is not about winning or losing, it is about adaptation. Men adapted to the rules they were given, and now the results of that adaptation are becoming visible. What happens next will depend on whether society is willing to examine cause rather than just react to effect. When people first hear about men recording interactions, the instinctive reaction is to treat it as a novelty, as something strange or extreme, but novelty is not what sustains a behavior. Convenience does not sustain it either. What sustains a behavior is necessity, and necessity is created when risk becomes unavoidable. Men did not arrive at this point because they wanted to. They arrived here because every alternative had been exhausted. Silence did not protect them. Compliance did not protect them. Good intentions did not protect them. Documentation, however, began to. Once you understand that, the panic surrounding this issue becomes easier to interpret. Panic is rarely about danger itself. Panic is about loss of control. For years, the balance of social power leaned heavily on narrative. Whoever controlled the story controlled the outcome. The moment interactions are recorded, narrative loses its flexibility. The story must match the footage, and when it does not, credibility collapses. That collapse is what many are reacting to, not the presence of cameras. This is also why the argument keeps circling back to feelings rather than facts. Discussions about being portrayed in an unflattering light avoid a crucial question. If the recording is accurate, then what is being portrayed is not distortion, it is behavior. Wanting the ability to reinterpret behavior after the fact is not the same as wanting fairness. Fairness applies equally, and evidence enforces equality whether anyone likes it or not. There is an irony here that rarely gets acknowledged. Many of the same voices demanding accountability in the past are now uncomfortable with being held to the same standard. For years, the message was clear that impact mattered more than intent, that perception mattered more than explanation. Recording interactions simply applies that framework symmetrically. If perception matters, then documentation matters even more. Another uncomfortable truth is that recording interactions protects everyone involved, not just the person holding the camera. It prevents exaggeration, misunderstanding, and escalation. It reduces the need for speculation and eliminates ambiguity. In theory, this should be welcomed by anyone who believes in fairness. The resistance to it suggests that fairness was never the real objective. Control was. As this practice becomes more common, behavior itself begins to change. People speak more carefully, they listen more closely, they avoid unnecessary escalation. This is often framed as chilling or restrictive, but it is more accurate to describe it as corrective. When words have weight, people choose them more deliberately. When actions are visible, people act with intention. This shift is not limited to dating or social interactions. It is influencing professional environments in ways that are already measurable. Men are opting out of informal conversations. Mentorship is becoming rare. Casual collaboration is giving way to documented communication. Meetings are structured, recorded, and summarized. Everything leaves a trail, and that trail protects those who participate carefully while discouraging those who rely on implication rather than substance. The cost of this transformation is not borne equally. When informal systems disappear, those who benefited most from ambiguity lose leverage. When everything is explicit, accountability becomes unavoidable. This is why some people describe the environment as colder. Warmth thrives in trust, and trust thrives in reciprocity. When reciprocity is removed, formality takes its place. It is important to understand that this is not about resentment. Resentment is loud and chaotic. What we are seeing instead is quiet withdrawal. Men are not demanding apologies. They are not organizing protests. They are simply stepping back, minimizing exposure, and choosing solitude or structured interaction over unpredictability. That is not rebellion, it is risk management. The phrase men walking away was once dismissed as exaggeration. Now it describes a measurable pattern. Men are disengaging from dating, from social spaces, from professional mentoring, and from institutions that treat them as liabilities rather than contributors. This disengagement is not dramatic, which is why it was ignored for so long. It happens one decision at a time, one avoided situation at a time, one boundary at a time. Technology accelerates this process because it makes alternatives visible. Men can find fulfillment without traditional relationships. They can build community online, pursue hobbies, invest in their own well being, and structure their lives around peace rather than validation. When those options exist, tolerance for risk decreases. Why gamble when stability is available elsewhere? Economic pressure reinforces this trend. As costs rise, expectations become heavier. When men are told they are unnecessary, but still expected to provide, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Walking away resolves that contradiction cleanly. It removes obligation without conflict. It is not revenge, it is clarity. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation would fail. Shame only works when the target values the approval of the source. When approval has already been withdrawn or declared irrelevant, shame loses power. Men who have adapted to solitude do not fear labels. They fear instability, and instability is exactly what they are avoiding. The South Korean example demonstrates how quickly this dynamic can become self reinforcing. Once men disengage, re engagement requires more than incentives, it requires trust. Trust cannot be legislated, purchased, or demanded. It must be earned through consistent behavior over time. That process is slow, and in some cases, it never fully succeeds. What is happening now is not isolated to one country or culture. It is a response to a global narrative that framed men as problems rather than partners. For decades, men were told to listen, learn, and step aside. Many did exactly that. Now they are being asked why they are absent. And the answer is that absence was the logical conclusion of the instructions they were given. Recording interactions is one expression of that logic. It says if participation is risky, participation will be controlled. If interaction is dangerous, interaction will be documented. If trust is assumed to be lacking, evidence will replace it. These are not emotional reactions, they are structural responses to incentives. Some argue that this environment will eventually correct itself, that balance will return naturally. History suggests otherwise. Systems do not self correct unless incentives change. If documentation continues to protect those who use it and expose those who abuse ambiguity, it will become standard. Norms follow outcomes, not ideals. There is also a generational aspect that deserves attention. Younger men are watching this unfold and adjusting early. They are growing up in a world where caution is normal, where recording is standard, and where disengagement is an option rather than a failure. They are learning from the experiences of those who came before them, and they are not interested in repeating mistakes. This generational shift matters because it shapes future expectations. When a generation grows up without assuming access to relationships or validation, they develop different priorities. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Self sufficiency replaces approval seeking. Stability replaces excitement. Documentation replaces trust. These priorities create a very different social landscape. Media narratives struggle to adapt to this reality because they are built on outdated assumptions. Stories that once resonated now feel disconnected. Attempts to frame men as villains fall flat when men have already opted out of the conversation. You cannot shame someone who is not seeking your approval, and you cannot coerce participation without offering value. The uncomfortable truth is that many men have discovered that peace is preferable to constant vigilance. Solitude, structure, and self direction offer predictability. Predictability is undervalued until chaos becomes common. Once chaos is experienced repeatedly, predictability becomes priceless. This is why the current moment feels tense. Old expectations are colliding with new behaviors. People who assumed compliance are encountering indifference. People who expected engagement are receiving distance. The rules changed and then the consequences arrived. Blaming the consequences does not undo the change. As this continues, society faces a choice. It can examine the incentives that led here, or it can attempt to suppress the outcomes. Suppression rarely succeeds long term. Incentives, however, shape behavior reliably. If trust, reciprocity, and fairness are restored, engagement will follow. If not, withdrawal will deepen. The conversation about recording interactions is therefore not about privacy alone. It is about trust, power, and accountability. It is about who bears risk and who controls narrative. Until those underlying issues are addressed, the surface debate will remain unresolved. Dating culture is one of the first places where this shift becomes impossible to ignore because dating has always relied on assumptions of good faith, spontaneity, and mutual vulnerability. When those assumptions collapse, the entire structure changes. What once felt organic now feels procedural. What once felt exciting now feels risky. Men are no longer approaching dating as an adventure or even as a hopeful pursuit, but as a cost benefit calculation. And once dating becomes a calculation, romance quietly exits the room. This is why many women report that men feel distant, guarded, or uninterested, even when they are polite and respectful. The politeness is real, but the investment is gone. Men are present physically while remaining emotionally insulated. They speak carefully, avoid ambiguity, and disengage quickly at the first sign of unpredictability. This is not because they lack desire, but because desire without safety is no longer worth pursuing. The introduction of recording technology into social spaces accelerates this transformation. When an interaction might be preserved indefinitely, every word carries weight beyond the moment. This discourages humor, flirtation, and improvisation because those rely on shared trust and tolerance for imperfection. Instead, conversations become neutral, restrained, and transactional. The energy shifts from curiosity to compliance, from exploration to containment. Many people misinterpret this as bitterness or hostility, but it is neither. It is caution refined by experience. Men learned, often the hard way, that what feels harmless in the moment can be reframed later under entirely different terms. Recording does not create this fear, it responds to it. It is the natural outcome of an environment where memory is selective, but evidence is permanent. This dynamic also explains why men increasingly prefer online interaction or controlled environments. Digital spaces allow for documentation, moderation, and distance. They reduce the risk of misinterpretation and provide clear boundaries. Offline interactions, by contrast, carry more variables and fewer safeguards. When risk exists in one domain and not the other, behavior shifts accordingly. Workplace dynamics follow a similar pattern, but with higher stakes. Careers, income, and reputation are on the line, and men are acutely aware of that. As a result, informal mentorship has declined sharply. Casual guidance has been replaced by formal channels. Conversations that once happened privately now require witnesses or documentation. Opportunities that once emerged through rapport now require credentials and process. This has consequences that are rarely acknowledged honestly. Informal mentorship was one of the primary ways people advanced, learned nuance, and navigated complexity. When that disappears, advancement becomes slower and more rigid. Those who relied on relationship based advancement find themselves struggling, while those who excel at structure and competition thrive. This is not favoritism, it is adaptation. The irony is that many policies designed to promote fairness end up reducing opportunity for those they intended to help. When interaction is risky, people minimize it. When guidance carries potential consequence, people withdraw it. The result is a colder but safer environment, one where everyone is treated equally, but few are supported generously. This shift also affects how men view long term commitment. And that commitment requires trust, vulnerability, and shared risk. When trust erodes and risk becomes one sided, commitment loses appeal. Men are not rejecting commitment out of immaturity or fear, they are rejecting asymmetry. They are unwilling to enter arrangements where consequences are uneven and accountability is unclear. As a result, many men are choosing lives that prioritize autonomy. They invest in their health, their finances, their interests, and their peace. They form friendships based on shared activity rather than emotional dependency. They build routines that are predictable and self sustaining. This lifestyle is not lonely in the way it is often portrayed. It is quiet, orderly, and stable. And for many men, that stability is worth more than validation. The broader cultural response to this trend has been confusion mixed with frustration. Some insist that men need to change, to re engage, to be more open. Others attempt to shame or guilt them back into participation. These approaches misunderstand the core issue. Men are not disengaging because they are unaware of expectations. They are disengaging because they understand them perfectly and have decided the trade off is not favorable. Economic conditions amplify this decision. When resources are limited, people become selective. Men are asking themselves whether investing time, energy, and resources into relationships that carry legal, emotional, and reputational risk is rational. Increasingly, the answer is no. This is not ideology, it is economics applied to personal life. The visibility of this trend creates anxiety because it challenges long held assumptions. For decades, men were expected to pursue, provide, and persist. Those expectations were treated as constants, not choices. What we are seeing now is the realization that they were always choices and that choices can change when conditions change. Recording interactions is simply one tool among many that men are using to navigate this new reality. It signals a desire for clarity and protection, not dominance. It says that if participation is required, it must be safe. If interaction is expected, it must be fair. These are not unreasonable demands, but they are incompatible with systems that rely on ambiguity. This incompatibility is why so many proposed solutions feel hollow. Calls for empathy that are not paired with accountability ring empty. Appeals to tradition that ignore modern incentives fail to persuade. Trust cannot be rebuilt through slogans. It must be rebuilt through behavior, consistency, and time. Another factor often overlooked is how quickly norms can shift once a critical mass is reached. As more men adopt documentation and distance, those behaviors become normalized. What once seemed extreme becomes standard. New expectations form, and reversing them becomes increasingly difficult. Norms do not revert easily once alternatives prove functional. The long term implications of the shift extend beyond individual relationships. They influence population trends, workforce dynamics, and social cohesion. When large numbers of people disengage from traditional structures, those structures weaken. Incentives must then be introduced to compensate, but incentives cannot replace trust. They can only mask its absence temporarily. We are already seeing early signs of the strain. Governments discuss declining birth rates, employers struggle with retention and morale, media narratives fail to resonate. Each of these symptoms points to the same underlying issue. Engagement has a cost, and when that cost exceeds perceived benefit, disengagement becomes rational. The question is not whether this trend is good or bad, the question is whether it is understood. Moralizing it does nothing, ignoring it makes it worse. Addressing it requires acknowledging the incentives that shaped it and the experiences that sustained it. Men did not arrive here suddenly. They arrived here gradually, adapting to each new rule, each new expectation, each new risk. Recording interactions is not the start of the story. It is one of its most visible chapters. And visibility is uncomfortable for systems built on selective memory. Media framing plays a critical role in shaping how this entire situation is perceived. And it is one of the reasons the conversation feels so disconnected from lived experience. When stories about men recording interactions appear in mainstream coverage, the focus almost always centers on discomfort and fear, while motivation is treated as an afterthought. The assumption baked into these narratives is that men are acting preemptively without cause, as if the behavior emerged in a vacuum rather than as a response to years of accumulated consequences. This framing reassures those who already agree, but it alienates those who recognize the pattern from personal experience. The problem with this approach is that it refuses to acknowledge causality. It treats outcomes as origins. Recording is described as the problem rather than as a symptom. The effect of this is predictable. Men who feel unheard disengage further, while institutions double down on messaging that no longer resonates. When reality and narrative diverge too far, people stop listening to the narrative. Legal structures reinforce this divide. Many laws governing interaction were written with good intentions but poor foresight. They expanded definitions, lowered thresholds, and emphasized subjective experience over objective verification. While this approach aimed to protect, it also created uncertainty. When rules are unclear and enforcement is inconsistent, risk increases. When risk increases, people seek protection. Documentation becomes that protection. What is rarely discussed is how this legal ambiguity affects behavior long before any formal complaint is made. The mere possibility of accusation changes how people act. It alters tone, posture, and willingness to engage. Recording interactions is not about anticipating wrongdoing. It is about reducing uncertainty in an environment where uncertainty carries disproportionate cost. This legal uncertainty also changes how men view institutions. Trust in systems declines when outcomes feel unpredictable. When people believe that process matters less than perception, faith erodes. Men do not withdraw because they dislike rules. They withdraw because rules no longer feel neutral. Recording interactions is a way to restore neutrality where it feels lost. Cultural messaging compounds this effect. For years, men were told to reflect, improve, and step back. They were encouraged to listen rather than speak and to accept criticism without defense. Many internalized that message and tried to comply. What they discovered was that compliance did not lead to resolution, it led to escalation. Each concession created expectation for the next. Eventually, a line was reached, not a dramatic breaking point, but a quiet realization. If no amount of compliance restores balance, then balance must be achieved another way. Withdrawal and documentation became that way. These strategies require no permission and provoke no confrontation. They simply change behavior. This is why calls for dialogue often fall flat. Dialogue assumes shared goals. Many men no longer believe those goals exist. They have learned that participation exposes them to risk without guarantee of reciprocity. Until that belief changes, dialogue will remain performative. Another layer of this issue involves the way social validation has shifted. In the past, participation in relationships and social systems brought status and meaning. Today, validation is fragmented. Men can find recognition through achievement, creativity, and self directed pursuits without entering traditional structures. When alternatives exist, pressure to conform weakens. This is especially true for younger men who grew up watching older generations struggle. They observed careers derailed by accusations, relationships implode under asymmetrical expectations, and institutions fail to provide protection. They learned from observation rather than instruction. As a result, they entered adulthood with a different risk tolerance. For these men, recording interactions is not radical, it is normal. It fits seamlessly into a world where everything else is already documented. Conversations, transactions, and experiences leave digital traces. Expecting personal interactions to be exempt feels outdated. Transparency is not shocking to them. Selective memory is. This generational shift creates tension because expectations have not adjusted accordingly. Some still assume automatic engagement, pursuit, and provision. When those assumptions go unmet, frustration follows. But frustration does not change incentives, only outcomes do. The narrative that the men are becoming colder misses the point. Men are becoming clearer. They are defining boundaries where ambiguity once existed. They are choosing predictability over performance. This clarity feels cold only to those accustomed to flexibility without accountability. It is important to note that this shift does not eliminate conflict, it changes its form. Instead of emotional disputes, there are procedural disagreements. Instead of arguments, there is disengagement. Instead of persuasion, there is silence. Silence is powerful because it offers no leverage. Many people underestimate how destabilizing silence can be. It removes the feedback loop that systems rely on to self adjust. When men stop complaining and simply leave, problems persist without visible opposition. Institutions mistake quiet for compliance until participation drops enough to be noticed. By the time that happens, trust is already gone. Attempts to reverse course feel insincere because they are reactive rather than reflective. Men recognize when they are being addressed as a problem to solve rather than as participants to value. Recording interactions in this context is both practical and symbolic. Practically, it protects against misinterpretation. Symbolically, it signals withdrawal of blind trust. It says that interaction will continue only under conditions of accountability. That message resonates precisely because it requires no confrontation. As more men adopt this stance, social norms shift. What once felt awkward becomes expected. Being recorded no longer feels personal. It becomes part of the environment. Behavior adjusts accordingly. People who adapt find fewer problems. Those who rely on ambiguity feel constrained. This creates a divide, not between genders, but between behavioral strategies. Those who value transparency thrive. Those who depend on reinterpretation struggle. This is not a moral judgment. It is an outcome of incentives. The long-term risk of this trajectory is not hostility, but fragmentation. When people retreat into parallel lives, shared understanding erodes. Cooperation becomes harder. Institutions strain under declining participation. Attempts to force engagement backfire, reinforcing the very withdrawal they seek to prevent. Addressing this requires more than messaging. It requires recalibrating incentives so that engagement feels safe, fair, and worthwhile. That means restoring due process, clarifying expectations, and distributing risk symmetrically. Without those changes, recording and disengagement will remain rational choices. The discomfort surrounding this trend is understandable. It signals a loss of informal power and narrative control. But discomfort is not injustice. Adjusting to accountability is not oppression. It is adaptation to a more transparent environment. Economic pressure does not create social change on its own, but it accelerates trends that are already underway. And in this case, it is acting like a force multiplier. When resources tighten, people become more selective about where they invest time, energy, and money. That selectivity exposes assumptions that once went unquestioned. For a long time, it was assumed that men would continue to participate regardless of cost, that they would absorb risk quietly and adapt endlessly. Economic reality challenges that assumption because it makes trade offs visible and unavoidable. As living expenses rise and financial stability becomes harder to maintain, men are asking different questions than they did in previous decades. They are not asking how to meet expectations. They are asking whether the expectations make sense. They are not asking how to prove value. They are asking who benefits from the proof. When those questions do not have satisfactory answers, disengagement becomes a rational choice rather than an emotional reaction. Financial independence plays a key role in this shift. Men who are less financially dependent on traditional social structures have more freedom to opt out. They can design lives that prioritize predictability and autonomy. They can invest in assets rather than appearances, in skills rather than status. When that option exists, participation becomes voluntary rather than obligatory. And voluntary participation requires value on both sides. This reality creates tension because many social expectations were built on the assumption of obligation. When obligation disappears, expectations feel unmet. But unmet expectations are not injustice, they are signals that conditions have changed. The challenge is that many institutions and narratives have not updated to reflect those changes. The idea of social contracts is useful here. A contract works only when both sides perceive benefit. For a long time, men accepted a contract that involved risk in exchange for purpose, recognition, and partnership. When those returns diminished while the risks increased, the contract lost credibility. Recording interactions is one way men signal that the terms have changed. It is a boundary marker that says participation now requires safeguards. This does not mean men are rejecting cooperation or connection altogether. It means they are redefining the conditions under which those things occur. Cooperation must be structured, connection must be reciprocal, risk must be shared. These requirements may feel restrictive to those accustomed to informal advantage, but they are reasonable within a system that values fairness. The economic dimension also reveals why attempts to frame this trend as a temporary phase fail. Economic incentives are persistent. When people adapt successfully to new conditions, they do not revert easily. Men who have built stable, independent lives without relying on traditional relationships are unlikely to abandon that stability without compelling reason. Comfort is a powerful teacher. This is why policy responses that focus solely on encouragement or incentives often miss the mark. Financial incentives can nudge behavior, but they cannot repair trust. Trust is built through consistency and accountability over time. Without that foundation, incentives feel transactional and short lived. People may respond briefly, but they do not commit. The workplace illustrates this clearly. Employers can offer benefits, programs, and messaging designed to foster engagement. But if employees do not feel protected by clear rules and fair enforcement, participation remains cautious. Men who have learned to document interactions and minimize exposure will continue to do so regardless of incentives. Their behavior is shaped by risk assessment, not enthusiasm. This risk assessment extends to long term planning. Men are increasingly structuring their futures around scenarios that do not depend on traditional partnerships. They plan for retirement, housing, and healthcare independently. They build social networks based on shared interest rather than dependency. This planning reduces vulnerability and increases confidence in solitude. The cultural response to this planning is often mischaracterization. Independence is framed as avoidance. Boundaries are framed as hostility. Documentation is framed as suspicion. These frames misunderstand the underlying motivation, which is stability. People seek stability when uncertainty becomes costly. That is not a rejection of others. It is a commitment to self preservation. Another important factor is how quickly information now spreads. Men share experiences and strategies online. They compare notes. They learn what works and what does not. Recording interactions becomes normalized not through ideology, but through demonstrated effectiveness. When people see others avoid harm by documenting interactions, they adopt the practice themselves. This peer learning accelerates change because it bypasses institutions entirely. Norms are established horizontally rather than imposed vertically. Once a critical mass adopts a behavior, it becomes standard regardless of official messaging. Attempts to discourage it appear out of touch, reinforcing skepticism toward authority. The result is a feedback loop. Documentation reduces risk. Reduced risk encourages continued use. Continued use normalizes the behavior. Normalization shifts expectations. Expectations reshape interactions. Each step reinforces the next. Breaking this loop would require altering the incentives at its foundation, not criticizing the behavior at its surface. It is also important to recognize that the shift affects emotional dynamics. When men disengage emotionally to reduce risk, they become less reactive. Less reactivity is often interpreted as lack of interest or warmth. In reality, it is emotional discipline. It is the choice to regulate responses to avoid escalation or misinterpretation. Emotional discipline has costs. It reduces spontaneity and vulnerability, but it also reduces conflict. In an environment where conflict can carry disproportionate consequences, emotional discipline becomes a survival skill. Recording interactions supports this discipline by reinforcing accountability. Some argue that this environment is unsustainable, that human connection requires risk and openness. That may be true in principle, but people adapt to the environments they inhabit, not the ideals they are told to value. If the environment punishes openness, openness declines. If it rewards caution, caution thrives. This adaptation does not make men unhappy in the way critics often assume. Many report greater peace, clarity, and focus. They replace external validation with internal metrics. They measure success by stability rather than approval. This shift in values makes traditional criticism ineffective because it targets priorities that are no longer central. The broader implication is that social cohesion changes shape. Instead of large, interconnected networks, smaller, more selective groups form. Trust exists within those groups because it is earned through repeated interaction and shared norms. Outside those groups, interactions are polite but distant. This fragmentation challenges institutions that rely on broad participation. It complicates efforts to build consensus. It makes messaging less effective. But it is also a predictable outcome of systems that prioritize risk management over trust building. As economic pressure continues, these patterns are likely to deepen. Scarcity sharpens decision making. People become less willing to gamble with uncertain outcomes. Men who have already adapted will continue refining their strategies. Those who have not will face increasing pressure to adjust. The conversation about recording interactions, therefore, is not a narrow debate about technology or privacy. It is a window into how incentives, economics, and trust interact. It reveals how quickly behavior changes when conditions shift, and how difficult it is to reverse those changes once they prove effective. The path forward, if there is one, requires acknowledging these dynamics honestly. It requires moving beyond blame and towards structural reform. It requires restoring predictability, fairness, and shared risk. Without those elements, disengagement remains the logical choice. Attempts to regulate behavior without addressing incentives have a long history of producing outcomes opposite to those intended. And this situation is no different. When lawmakers, institutions, or commentators suggest restricting the ability to record interactions, the proposal often rests on the assumption that removing the tool will restore trust. In reality, removing a tool without removing the underlying risk only increases anxiety. When people feel less protected, they do not become more open, they become more withdrawn, more cautious, and more selective. This is the paradox at the heart of the current debate. Documentation exists because trust eroded. Eliminating documentation does not rebuild trust, it merely removes one of the few remaining safeguards. In environments where consequences are severe and uncertainty is high, people do not respond to vulnerability by opening up, they respond by disengaging. History shows that when people feel unsafe, they do not lean in, they step back. This is why proposals to ban or discourage recording often provoke quiet resistance rather than relief. Men interpret these proposals not as protection for everyone, but as removal of one of the few mechanisms that restored balance. When someone feels that a system already disadvantages them, removing a protective measure feels like confirmation rather than compromise. That perception alone is enough to harden withdrawal. The unintended consequences of such regulation extend beyond individual behavior. If recording becomes restricted in public or professional settings, interactions do not suddenly become warmer or more trusting. Instead, they become rarer. Men reduce contact. They avoid environments where ambiguity exists. They limit interaction to situations with witnesses or formal oversight. Informality disappears even further. This mirrors patterns seen in highly regulated environments elsewhere. When rules are too complex or punitive, people do not engage creatively. They comply minimally or exit entirely. Compliance becomes mechanical rather than meaningful. That is not trust. That is survival. The idea that trust can be mandated misunderstands how trust functions. Trust emerges from repeated positive interactions where risk is shared and accountability is clear. It cannot be imposed through restriction or messaging. In fact, heavy handed intervention often signals that trust is absent, reinforcing the very fear it seeks to alleviate. Another overlooked consequence of restricting documentation is the effect on dispute resolution. Evidence simplifies resolution. It reduces reliance on memory, interpretation, and bias. When evidence is removed, disputes become more subjective. Subjectivity increases conflict rather than reducing it. People argue longer, harder, and with less certainty. Outcomes feel arbitrary. Confidence in systems declines. This decline in confidence is not theoretical, it is experienced. Men who have watched outcomes hinge on perception rather than proof learn quickly where the risk lies. They adapt accordingly. Recording interactions is not about winning disputes. It is about avoiding them altogether by preventing misinterpretation before it escalates. This preventive function is rarely acknowledged in public discussion. Recording is framed as adversarial when, in practice, it often discourages conflict. People behave more thoughtfully when they know their actions are visible. That visibility creates a natural check on escalation. Removing it removes that check. There's also a broader cultural pattern at play involving accountability asymmetry. When one group feels constantly scrutinized while another feels insulated, resentment builds, even if it remains unspoken. Men respond to asymmetry not by arguing endlessly, but by changing behavior. Withdrawal is quieter and more effective than confrontation. This pattern explains why public debates often miss their mark. The people being discussed are no longer invested in persuading others. They are invested in minimizing exposure. They listen, note the direction of discourse, and adjust privately. By the time concern becomes visible, the shift is already entrenched. The focus on technology in this debate also distracts from a deeper issue. Technology does not dictate values, it amplifies them. Recording devices reflect a desire for clarity and protection. Removing devices does not remove that desire. It forces it to express itself in other ways, often less transparent and more disruptive. For example, instead of recording, men may insist on third party presence in interactions. They may avoid one on one meetings. They may restrict communication to written channels only. These alternatives are less efficient and less personal, but they reduce risk. Restricting one method simply pushes behavior toward another. This substitution effect is why regulation often fails to achieve its goals. Behavior adapts, incentives remain, outcomes persist. Without addressing the incentive structure, intervention becomes a game of whack a mole rather than a solution. The economic cost of this adaptation is significant. Productivity declines when collaboration is constrained. Innovation suffers when informal exchange disappears. Relationships become brittle when flexibility is lost. These costs are diffuse and long term, making them easy to ignore until they accumulate. And at the personal level, the cost is emotional distance. When people protect themselves by limiting vulnerability, intimacy declines. That decline is often blamed on individual attitudes rather than structural incentives. But individuals are responding rationally to their environment. Blame does not change that. The reality is that many men have already recalibrated their expectations. They no longer assume that participation will be rewarded. They no longer assume that good faith will be reciprocated. They operate under the assumption that protection must be proactive. Recording interactions fits that assumption neatly. This recalibration also explains why appeals to nostalgia fail. Invoking past norms ignores present conditions. People do not return to old behaviors simply because they are reminded of them. They return only if conditions support them. Without restored balance, nostalgia becomes noise. The longer this dynamic persists, the more entrenched it becomes. New norms solidify. Younger generations internalize them as default. What once felt extreme becomes ordinary. At that point, reversing course requires far more effort than preventing the shift in the first place. This is why the current moment matters. It is not a passing controversy, it is a structural inflection point. How society responds will shape interaction norms for decades. Choosing to suppress symptoms rather than address causes guarantees continued disengagement. Addressing causes means confronting uncomfortable questions. Why did trust erode? Why did ambiguity become leverage? Why did accountability become uneven? These questions challenge existing narratives and power structures. Avoiding them is easier than answering them, but avoidance carries cost. Men are not asking for privilege. They are asking for predictability. They are not demanding control. They are choosing boundaries. Recording interactions is one boundary among many. It is a signal that participation will continue only under conditions that feel fair. Ignoring that signal does not make it disappear, it amplifies it. When people feel unheard, they disengage further. Silence replaces dialogue, distance replaces connection. These outcomes are already visible. As this unfolds, it becomes clear that the future of interaction depends on whether systems adapt to new realities or cling to outdated assumptions. Adaptation requires humility and willingness to reassess. Clinging requires denial and enforcement. History suggests that adaptation ultimately prevails, but not without friction. The friction we are seeing now is that adjustment phase. Old expectations collide with new behaviors, tension rises, narrative strain. But beneath that noise, incentives continue to shape action quietly and consistently. If trust is ever going to be rebuilt, it will not come from pressure, restriction, or moralizing. Trust cannot be argued into existence, and it cannot be legislated into compliance. It emerges when incentives align with behavior and when accountability is consistent rather than selective. That is the part of the conversation most people avoid because it requires admitting that past frameworks produced predictable outcomes. Rebuilding trust begins with restoring predictability. Predictability does not mean perfection, it means clarity. People need to know what is expected of them and what will happen if expectations are met or violated. When rules are vague and enforcement feels uneven, people protect themselves. Recording interactions is one expression of that protection. Remove the need for protection, and the behavior fades naturally. Leave the need intact, and no amount of messaging will change it. Predictability also requires symmetrical accountability. Systems that punish one side more harshly than the other do not foster trust. They foster caution. Men learned that lesson repeatedly. They learned it through observation, experience, and comparison. Trust cannot exist where consequences are asymmetrical. It collapses under imbalance. Another necessary condition for rebuilding trust is reciprocity. Reciprocity means that effort is matched, risk is shared, and responsibility flows in both directions. For many men, reciprocity disappeared long before recording devices appeared. They were told to give without expectation and to accept outcomes without question. Over time, that expectation eroded goodwill. When goodwill erodes, structure replaces it. Structure is not inherently bad. It brings order and clarity, but it cannot substitute for connection and to indefinitely. A society built entirely on procedures and documentation may be safe, but it will be emotionally sparse. The question is whether safety and connection can coexist again under updated terms. That depends on whether incentives change. Changing incentives requires more than surface level reform. It requires reevaluating how narratives are constructed and how responsibility is assigned. It requires acknowledging that good intentions do not negate harmful outcomes. It requires listening to behavior rather than dismissing it. When large numbers of people disengage quietly, that is data. Ignoring data does not make it disappear. Men have been communicating through action for years. Their withdrawal, caution, and reliance on documentation are messages. Those messages say that participation feels unsafe and unrewarding. Responding to that message with blame or restriction only confirms it. Responding with reflection and reform offers a different path. That path is difficult because it challenges deeply held assumptions. It requires admitting that systems designed to protect may have overcorrected. It requires recognizing that accountability must apply universally to be credible. It requires restoring due process and clarity without retreating into hostility or resentment. It also requires patience. Trust rebuilds slowly. It is earned through consistent behavior over time, not through declarations or campaigns. Men who adapted to withdrawal will not reverse course overnight. They will watch outcomes. They will assess whether incentives truly changed or merely shifted rhetorically. This assessment will be pragmatic rather than emotional. Men who have learned to prioritize stability do not gamble easily. They will re engage only when the environment proves itself reliably fair. That reliability must persist across context and time. Anything less will be treated as temporary. The role of technology in this future remains significant. Documentation will not disappear. Transparency is now embedded in daily life. The challenge is not to eliminate visibility, but to integrate it into systems that value fairness and accountability. When visibility supports trust rather than replaces it, relationships can regain depth without sacrificing safety. Until then, documentation remains as a rational response. Recording interactions is not a statement of hostility. It is a boundary drawn in response to experience. Boundaries exist to protect, not to punish. Understanding that distinction is essential if progress is to be made. The broader cultural implication of this moment is a reevaluation of social contracts. Old assumptions about obligation, pursuit, and provision are being replaced by negotiated participation. Participation now depends on perceived value and safety rather than tradition. This shift unsettles those who relied on default engagement, but it empowers those who felt exposed. Empowerment through withdrawal may seem paradoxical, but it is effective. When people realize they have options, their tolerance for imbalance decreases. That realization spreads quickly in connected societies. Men share strategies, compare outcomes, and adjust collectively without coordination. This organic adaptation is difficult to counter because it is rooted in lived experience rather than ideology. The result is a quieter but more decisive form of change. There are no slogans, there are no marches. There is simply a steady reallocation of time, energy, and attention away from environments perceived as risky. That reallocation reshapes culture more effectively than protest ever could. What remains is a choice. Society can interpret this shift as a problem to suppress or as feedback to address. Suppression leads to deeper disengagement. Addressing feedback opens the possibility of recalibration. That recalibration requires humility and willingness to change incentives rather than appearances. Men are not asking for a return to the past, they are responding to the present. Any future that seeks their participation must reflect that reality. Trust must be rebuilt on terms that acknowledge experience rather than dismiss it. Accountability must be mutual. Risk must be shared. Clarity must replace ambiguity. Until those conditions are met, the trends we are witnessing will continue. Men will document interactions, they will minimize exposure, they will invest in independence, they will choose peace over performance. These choices are not ideological, they are practical. Understanding that practicality is the first step toward meaningful change. Ignoring it ensures continued fragmentation. The direction forward is not mysterious, it is simply uncomfortable. It requires admitting that some paths led to unintended consequences and that correction is necessary. Whether that correction happens remains to be seen. But the behavior itself is the message. Men have adapted to the environment they were given. If the environment changes, behavior will follow. If it does not, withdrawal will deepen. Before we close, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with the direction things are moving? Are you seeing similar patterns in your own life or among people you know? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter and they help bring clarity to issues that are often ignored or misunderstood. Like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MJ, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.